My great-great-grandfather was born on a plantation in Southampton, Virginia. He was born to the Blow family. They eventually moved to St. Louis. At this point, they had debts, and they had to sell something to cure those debts. My great-great-grandfather was purchased by an army surgeon.
The slave is taken into the Wisconsin Territory, in what is now Minnesota.
And he met and married a young lady. Slaves were prohibited actually to marry. So it's pretty special that they actually had a wedding. Brought back to St. Louis with his family. At that point, he had something unique. Missouri had a law that said once free, always free.
And Wisconsin Territory is free soil, no slavery.
If a slaveholder were to take a slave and live in the North, then that slave would be liberated.
They were no longer a slave.
But their owner refuses to free them. And in 1846, the slaves enter this courtroom to seek their freedom.
At first it was just about their family, but ultimately it was about a nation. And my ancestor was Dred Scott.
A jury of 12 white men set Dred and Harriet Scott free.
It was a wonderful day, but it was short-lived.
Scott's owner appeals the verdict.
And then the Supreme Court of Missouri changed the precedent of Missouri to say, it didn't free him, and that's when he brought his federal action.
Dred Scott's case lands in the U.S. Supreme Court. The court was stacked against Scott. Of the 9 justices, 5 were from slave states, and a 6th from Pennsylvania also favored slavery. The justices voted 7-2 against Scott, and they did something the framers never imagined. They invented a constitutional right to own slaves.
Some of the worst jurisprudence by our United States.
That was the classic example of the Supreme Court taking upon itself to do what it thought was right and not adhere to the text of the Constitution as it was written.
In his decision, Chief Justice Taney writes,
Negroes have been regarded as beings of inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race. And the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit.
What Dred Scott did was to say, yes, they said all men are created equal, but they didn't mean it.
In terms of how it feels now as I'm saying this to you, it angers me. How can one man tell another man that he's benefiting me by enslaving me?
I can't imagine that anything could be worse.
And that blacks could never be citizens for as long as they lived in America.
Because you cannot possibly be, under any circumstances, a citizen of the United States if you're black and you're descendant from slaves.
Taney thought he was going to resolve the slavery controversy forever by basically saying, stop arguing about this question, it's settled. But he was wrong. You don't settle a controversy like that simply by saying, I'm right, you're wrong.
Within 3 months of the Dred Scott decision, they did get their freedom. And they did not get it through the courts, but they got it from the hand of the children of their original owners. Dred and Harriet were simple people. The fact that they were born in slavery did not deny them their humanity, nor any human desires as anyone else would have. Their greatest desire was freedom.
The laws still weren't living up to that ideal. In fact, the Dred Scott case was a big step backwards.
Most northern states were content to let the southern states be the southern states, and they weren't prepared to do anything about slavery in the South.
Until the Dred Scott decision.
And that led to a grave perception of a threat. The North finally cared about slavery in a way they hadn't before. And then we know what happened after that.
Between December 1860 and the following June, 11 states secede from the Union and ignite the worst constitutional crisis in American history.